Sammy is currently working with CLR on a project that investigates AI misuse scenarios. He's also involved with running the Modeling Transformative AI Risk Forecasting project and conducting technical research in cooperative AI in benchmarking cooperative intelligence. He's currently most interested in AI strategy and forecasting, with a strong inclination towards incorporating expertise from diverse fields such as politics, international relations, and other disciplines to address AI strategy questions. He's also keen to explore methods to aggregate knowledge from various sources and reason better under deep uncertainty. So Sammy, I see you have your slides up already, and I'll remind people that you can use the Q&A option to ask questions, and feel free to start, Sam.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Sahil. So yes, I've been working during my time at PIBBSS on this overview and high-level analysis of what misuse risks from transformative AI we have to worry about, and also what to do about them. So, first of all, what do I mean by misuse risks or existential misuse risks? Because obviously any technology can be misused. What I'm talking about here are what are the ways in which we could see human extinction or the world being irreversibly ruined in some other way by transformative AI without an AI takeover, without it being the case that we're concerned about highly adversarial AI systems that are directly working against what we want. And of course, how do we block them off? Are there specific things that seem especially risky that we can, deal with a large class of these worries all at once, for example? So the original brief of this project was this term misuse risk, but of course that's controversial because there's lots of things that you might be concerned about that aren't a classic example of one nefarious person doing some single individual clearly destructive thing. But really the point here is to look at scenarios where the culprit is mainly human, not AI agency, where it's not a highly adversarial AI that's doing something nobody wants, taking over. And this could include some of the things that are sometimes called structural risks with no obvious single culprit. And also the focus is what will be possible from now until the point, whenever that is, where we get generally capable, very transformative AI systems. And for those of you who don't know, the basic idea is transformative AI is AI that can substitute for humans at basically everything relevant economically or intellectually. And it's an assumption in a lot of the scenarios that this is not something that's very far away, and that you can sort of project forward various things about how the world works now and reliably predict things about how either transformative AI or the sorts of technologies we might get before transformative AI might be used. So I'm going to give an overview of how the categorization that I developed for these risks works and why I chose it, and sort of give a high-level overview of the sorts of dangers that arise in each one, and then explain why I think that the thing to worry about most in misuse risk is wars, and how to think about the effects of transformative AI on the likelihood of large wars, and then break down specific AI-enabled dangerous technologies and mention what we should be focusing on. So basically, wars are important. Within wars, specific technologies are important. And that small segment of things, I believe, accounts for quite a large fraction of the overall risk, which is both bad but also good, because it means there's fewer things to worry about, which means more targeted interventions might be useful. So another way of thinking about what this could be, how to think about this. This was from a post by Paul Cristiano, who's running Archivals and various other things, where basically the things I've circled in black, i.e. most humans die for non-takeover reasons or the future is irreversibly messed up. These are the things that are the focus of my research, not various forms of AI takeover. So these are the four categories that I adopted: wars, totalitarianism, decay, and non-anthropocentric risks. Now, these are essentially defined by, these are the categories that I place misuse risks into, are defined by where the world eventually ends up, i.e. how the disaster comes about, not the underlying causes. In some, there was another very recently released categorization of failure scenarios, which was based on these intermediate states, not on the end state. I adopted these categorizations because they were a natural extension of an expert survey that was done in 2019 by Clark and a few others on, they just surveyed a whole load of AI safety and governance experts, basically asking them, what do you think if things go wrong, how do they go wrong? The first three were variations on AI takeover scenarios, so we ignore these. But the remainder, which if you add up the probabilities, is about 40% of the probability mass of like the average researcher, although there was a lot of variation, so don't take that too seriously, was covered by what they called war scenarios, misuse scenarios, or other scenarios. Now, I went through all of these, and the misuse scenarios were what I call decay, which is where scenarios where there's no obvious takeover from there's no obvious totalitarian takeover or destructive war, but the future is still made very vulnerable because of AI. And other scenarios, which were a mixture of totalitarian takeover of human society and decay scenarios where society becomes very unstable, and what I called non-anthropocentric, which is scenarios where essentially the future is very bad by some kind of impartial light, but it's not superficially dystopian or extinction level. So you might have a superficially nice life, but perhaps we don't fulfill our potential, or there's some hidden terrible cost that we're not seeing. So that's the sort of quick overview of why I developed these categories, but this flowchart shows how they're defined. So if you can read this, you can see it's the first question is, if we end up in an existential catastrophe that doesn't result from AI takeover, if humans go extinct, then is it through the use of weapons that directly kill people? If it's in a war, then it's war. If it's because of a non-war scenario where weapons are used, that's a decay scenario. If it's because the adoption of some non-weapon AI increases fragility to such a large extent that it's very easy to finish us off, then it's decay. If we end up in some stable state that's really bad, then it's totalitarian. If it's stable and not superficially bad, then it's non-anthropocentric. And I won't go into these scenarios any further, these last ones, because they're, well, not because I think they're fundamentally unimportant, but because it introduces a load of extra complexity. So we've got three for now. So let's start with totalitarianism. And by the way, these are all generated by Midjourney, of course. So why could very advanced AI systems promote totalitarianism, or in some other way, which here I don't necessarily mean in the classic 1984 sense of a sort of oppressive government, but any very bad value system that gets an absolute control over most of humanity. So one way is just, you could imagine a very extreme advantage given to very heavily centralized governments controlled by small numbers of people who can impose lots of rules over their citizens, because you can just automate nearly everything. You can automate the economy, so you don't need to worry about having to, actually keep workers in line. You can automate your military, so you can crush dissent easily. You can easily surveil people. You can persuade them very effectively because AI turns out to be exceptionally capable at that. And you can even imagine there being plausible motivations to do all of this, not just that it becomes easier, so it might happen, but that you might be very concerned about AI-related weapons proliferation, which we'll get onto later. So that gives you an excuse or a sort of reason to expand the scope of surveillance. Our conclusion, which I can't justify in 1 minute, was that this very worst case scenario, where there's the lock-in of a absolutely like abhorrent state that's also totally ruling across the earth, seems quite unlikely. Marginally increased authoritarianism seems more likely, although of course if it were to happen it would be very bad. So yes, moving on. Decay scenarios where AI increases fragility, as I described. Now there's quite a few things that could go in here. One is we could heavily automate infrastructure that turns out to be very vulnerable, for example, because it's based on deep learning systems that are very adversarially vulnerable. We could transition to a society that's a lot more unequal and, with a very, very concentrated distribution of power, which could lead to social unrest. And we could also have very highly effective asymmetric weapons technologies, like the ability to synthesize bioweapons or launch very destructive drone, cyber attacks or something, be spread to the point where it's within the grasp of like small terrorist groups. So society could be left in a permanently vulnerable state, as Nick Bostrom talks about. Now, these are kind of all over the map in terms of severity. The general trend seems to be that the ones that are more likely seem like they could result in quite suboptimal social outcomes, with maybe a lot of inequality, maybe democratic backsliding, but nothing ruinous. The one exception being the last scenario I mentioned, which was the proliferation of very dangerous weapons technologies. But there are a few scenarios in here that could potentially result in something like one of the totalitarian takeover scenarios. And then we have wars. Now, on your generic prior expectation, it seems like a war that is caused or worsened by powerful technologies is a sort of fairly obvious way that a very generally influential technology could become really destructive. We have a sort of track record as a species of applying new scientific advances towards more efficient ways of killing each other. But there's a few specific things to think about in the context of transformative AI development that seem like it's not just the generic prior that this could be dangerous, but that there's specific things to worry about. One is just that there's a generic concern, even aside from specific technologies we might develop, that if weapons development progress and general technical progress is dramatically accelerated, and there's also the expectation, which might not even be correct, but there's the perception that pretty soon we might get to a point of no return where whoever's sufficiently far in the lead will become unchallengeable, whether that's a country or a smaller group, then that provides a stake, makes the future seem more all or nothing. It provides a stake for a potential war to break out. And it also, means that arms races more easily get out of control. It also could potentially make the worst case scenario of a war worse than our current worst case scenario, because although I can't go into the details right now, it's generally believed that a nuclear war, were it to break out immediately, would probably not be an extinction risk and might not actually be a civilization, like overall civilization destroying risk either, depending on lots of details. And yeah, there's also just specific risky technologies that might, by their very nature, make the chance for war more likely. So this seems like a prima facie, first glance, obvious thing to focus on. And even having looked at some of the other misuse or structural risk scenarios, this still seems like it stands out as being a mixture of somewhat plausible and unusually dangerous. So how should we think about the ways that transformative AI can make war worse? I've already talked about the general reasons why progress might provide incentives to start a conflict. But there's also specific risky technologies that we can look at that are sort of easier to think about and examine on a technical level than these general factors, like the general perception of being in a race, whether or not that perception is accurate. And also the other scenario that seemed unusually dangerous, which are some of the decay scenarios that revolve around mass terror, or the ability to use asymmetric weapons. A lot of this reasoning also applies there. So I do think this captures quite a large segment of the overall risk posed. So what are the features of specific technologies that are worth worrying about? As I've already mentioned, weapons of mass destruction that are worse than what the current worst case would be, and technologies that seem to make the strategic situation more unstable. So that increase the speed of warfare, undermine the current balance of deterrence. So in some sense, make the nuclear mutually assured destruction less assured, or make it harder to be assured of winning conventionally without resorting to nuclear weapons, and that increases the likelihood of an accident of some sort that leads to a war when no one even wants one. So I've listed 8 different technologies here. And the last three I don't have time to talk about now, but these are technologies that transformative AI has the potential to either accelerate or enable when they wouldn't have been possible before. So AI-enhanced bioweapons, AI-enhanced cyber attacks, possibly from autonomous AI agents that can replicate over the internet, fully autonomous, lethal autonomous weapons that can make complicated decisions themselves, not just follow simple instructions, automated strategic command and control that could, for example, control a nuclear arsenal or large parts of a military without human oversight, and accelerated automatically weapons research and development, which could include things like having fully automated prototyping and building of weapon systems, as well as just that. And then there's AI enabling the development of, orbital weapons, advanced nuclear arms, and nanotechnologies, which, again, outside the scope of what I'm talking about now. So there's basically 5 broad steps that, from one of these technologies being conceptualized to it actually causing an existential catastrophe. And this you might recognize as being a bit similar to the way that Joe Carlsmith's analysis of AI takeover risk was done, where you have a bunch of conjunctive steps. So do the intellectual capabilities exist? Given that the intellectual capabilities, i.e. you have AI smart enough to enable the technology, is the intent to build the technology and the practical, like non-intellectual, raw resources, factories, that sort of thing, do those exist? Will a war start, given technology has been developed? Maybe it'll start anyway. Maybe this will make it more likely for one of the reasons I've described. And then will it escalate to a sort of total war, or what's sometimes called insensate war, where essentially every weapons technology is used to its fullest extent? And then given that that happens, what's the chance that it's bad enough to constitute an existential catastrophe? So how do we think about how a weapons technology influences these factors? So this giant flowchart basically shows different ways that a weapons technology can influence the likelihood of moving along one of these steps to the latest one. Now, I know it's a bit hard to read and there's a lot of different factors here, so I will break them down like this. There's 9 questions. Basically, number 1, do we expect the technology to be developed soon? Does it seem easier than generally transformative AI? Does it seem to not depend too much on external inputs for automating research and development? So in other words, does it seem like something that you can just do in software without needing lots of complicated real-world feedback to research and build it? Does it not seem to depend too much on practical hardware, which is obviously bottlenecked by factories and production? Or maybe it does depend on that, but you think you can automate that too? Is it hard to control proliferation? And is there current interest from governments and companies in developing the tech? Is the technology intrinsically hard to defend against? So like the joke goes, the only person that stops a bad guy with super Ebola COVID is a good guy with super Ebola COVID, right? It's some technologies are basically offense dominant. Does the existence of the technology raise the chance for war for the reasons given previously? And is it worse than our current worst case scenario for a large war? So these are, quite detailed research questions. And if you're doing the maths in your head, this is now 8 times 9, so 72 detailed research questions. I obviously can't go through all of them, so I'm just going to give you high-level overviews to justify my overall conclusions about what's most worth worrying about. So this is a table showing the answers to these questions based on the current state of play for the 2 most dangerous in the near term technologies in my view and the view of my partner on this research, Alan Chan, which are bioweapons and AI-enabled bioweapons and cyber attacks. Red means that the answer to the relevant question is a yes, i.e. a bad thing that you don't want. Green means it's a good thing. There's something blocking the thing from being as dangerous as it could be. And orange means it's somewhat true. So the overall conclusions that you can get from these 2, which are the near term and higher risk, is that it seems like, according to some assessments done, for example, by Anthropic, bioweapons seem, are by their nature potentially beyond nuclear weapons in their danger. It seems to be the case, according to assessments, that the underlying technology is not too far off. I've heard 2 to 3 years before it's possible to accelerate development, but that's not come up with new innovations. That's enable access to developing current technologies. And more like several years after that, where before it's coming up with stuff de novo. There are physical bottlenecks, of course, which is something that could be used to sort of block development. And it's possible that the technology could be dual use, that you could get transmissible vaccines or other sorts of warning systems from the same advances. But it seems like the offense-defense balance is unfavorable. So yes, however, they are militarily pretty useless tactically unless they can be made highly targeted. And they've not really been used in any conflict yet for that reason. Cyber attacks, of course, can be defended against. So there are effective countermeasures, and they do use the same underlying technologies, and they aren't capable of inflicting worse than nuclear damage on the world. But as with bioweapons, they seem near term and potentially quite escalatory. So we've got a bad answer to that question there. So yeah, overall, these two stand out as being near term, hard to counter, and without much significant, like really strong, like material barriers to getting the technologies automated and developed relatively quickly. So yeah, now moving on to the lower tier, relatively speaking, of risks. Again, I know there's a lot here. Just pay attention to the colors. The detailed descriptions aren't so important. We have faster weapons research and development, more effective lethal autonomous weapons, and automated strategic command and control. These technologies tend to be faced by at least some amount of physical automation and procurement challenges. So they all rely more on being able to mass produce actual physical machinery, which has to go through development lags and procurement lags. Those can be circumvented in an arms race, of course. And there is current interest. For example, the US government's interested in more effective lethal autonomous weapons. But also, there's some amount of uncertainty about exactly how escalatory or dangerous these technologies could be. There's reasons to believe that generally faster weapons research and development is going to be extremely destabilizing. If you can go from a concept to a fully realized, unchallengeable new weapon system in a couple of years when it might have taken you 25 or 30 before, that seems quite dangerous, even if it is countered. But for example, it's possible that sufficiently well thought through automated command and control and lethal autonomous weapons could be, less dangerous than the current ways that wars are fought, although that seems quite uncertain. And also they don't have this feature of being clearly worse than the current worst case, which some of the later ones that I didn't talk about, like advanced nuclear and nanotechnological weapons, potentially could. But still, these are well worth paying attention to, especially because the bottlenecks might not be as severe as it might seem that they are. We can also see that they might potentially, that they're likely to take longer, potentially for the underlying technical developments. Fully automating weapons research and development seems quite close to being able to fully automate everything else, which means it would be coincident with generally transformative AI, which is later than being able to do these specific accelerations on narrow tasks. So that's my breakdown. Wars seem the most important, and of wars, these specific dangerous near-term capabilities seem the most important of those, with this other collection of more intermediate-term risks that are more than 5 years out, like much better autonomous weapons also being substantial. This seems like a large proportion of the risk comes from a fairly small set of specific technologies, and potentially targeting the ability to do these and making sure they don't proliferate could deal with a lot of the total risk from not from AI takeover or from misuse, and therefore it seems to make the problem a lot more tractable, assuming that this prioritization is correct. I've listed a bunch of ways that this could be wrong, always a good idea, and that further research should probably investigate whether any of these are true. There's a lot here, but for example, if we don't solve the adversarial robustness problems that a lot of current foundation models have, then that could imperil a lot of developing these sorts of technologies and applying them to high stakes cases. or people might go ahead and do it anyway, in which case they'd be extremely vulnerable and extremely unreliable. This notion of automating research and development is harder than it looks, which is always possible, then that could mean that the systems that are more about robot control or autonomous behavior, like cyber attacks, could be, more near term, and stuff like being able to research new weapons or new bioweapons could be harder to do. It's also possible that sufficiently capable technologies in autonomous weapons and cyber defense could just mean that we actually end up with a defense dominant situation where actually we're safer. But currently, that's what my assessment looks like. And I'm going to be investigating this further in my new role at the Transformative Futures Institute. But I'd like to thank PIBBSS for giving me the opportunity to go through all of this. It's, I think that we've been able to get some strategic clarity on what things are really important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. That was seemed like very hard and impressive work. I have a question from Madhav here, which is, you mentioned you decided to classify misuse risks by causes instead of intermediary means. Mm-hmm. For example, AI used to promote misinformation versus AI used to destroy critical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Could you explain why you made this choice? Do you think your classifications by causes offer some benefit in finding solutions compared to classifying by intermediary failure modes?
Yes, this is a good question. It's partly because it was the most similar to how the survey was done. But the real reason, and the reason that I think it's a good idea to classify it by this way, is that with a technology like transformative AI, it's going to affect the world in so many different ways, and there will be a large number of effects, and a large fraction of those effects could be bad because that's just the nature of change in general. So I think, and it's quite easy to identify, you mentioned one, like spread of disinformation, centralization of power in large corporations. There's lots of things that could be quite bad by ordinary standards, but don't realistically rise to the level of extinction risk. And I think looking at, okay, how does the disaster actually happen, and working backwards from that is a good way to focus yourself on the things that are the most risky, instead of just identifying general structural factors that seem generically bad or risk promoting, although I do think there is room for that as well.
Cool. There is another question that maybe you already answered, but you might want to weigh in again, and I think we have time, which is, Patrick asks, do you separate physical violent wars from other race conditions like cyber warfare?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Do you separate physical violent wars from other race conditions like cyber warfare?
Yeah, so being in a race is not the same as actually being in a war, but certainly if when I mention wars, I'm not just talking about like you declare war and you launch, your aircraft and missiles at the enemy. Some of these war scenarios might be, for example, especially if we're in a future that looks quite different to the current one, might be extensively fought with cyber warfare, or they might just be both sides threatening to release incredibly destructive bioweapons, and then they both do as some kind of countervalue, like mutual madness preemptive attack. And very little conventional fighting goes on. So I'm using the term war because that's an accurate description, and I think there's lots of potential for those sorts of things too. But there's plenty of ways that you could have something that's technically a war that doesn't really look like one. I did mention that a pure cyber war is certainly considered here, but of course, unless the world changes and becomes way more heavily automated, even a very bad cyber war would not rise to the level of damage of like a nuclear war, unless, those systems get hacked, for example, which, yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sammy. And for those who want to continue chatting with Sammy in just a half hour, there will be breakout rooms where we can all talk to each other in a free-form way.
Great, thank you.